So today I'm standing in Reese Cemetery in Springfield, Michigan. There's a lot of amazing stories here we're going to talk about today, including some drownings, some crashing carriages, and even some burning buildings. So come along and join me. Before we begin today, I wanted to thank everyone who's come along with me on this journey. My channel crossed the 1,000 subscriber threshold in February, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you who've believed in what I've been doing. If you are new to this channel, please take a moment to subscribe, and also hit the like button and leave a comment telling me what you think of the video. Comments and likes on videos encourages YouTube to make the video available to other people when searching on the platform, and thus helps me reach more people with these amazing stories of local history. And with that in mind, I want to offer you a challenge. In your comment today, use the purple heart emoji as part of your comments. You can just use the heart itself or leave a comment and use the emoji in there. In today's video, there's going to be a purple heart recipient in one of the profiles. So even if you're not sure what to write in a comment, just do that. It will count as a comment on YouTube. Now let's get into the stories of Reese Cemetery. Reese Cemetery is located on the corner of Dickman Road and Helmer Road in Springfield, Michigan, across from the Kellogg Airfield. It is an older cemetery in the area with burial dates that go back into the mid to late 1800s. The cemetery is named after the Reese family, of whom many are buried here. The family has two different spellings of Reese, R-E-E-S-E, as the cemetery bears its name, and also R-E-E-S. The name is from the Welsh origin, which means enthusiastic or ardent, and is the anglicized form of R-H-Y-S, Rees, which was the name of the last ruler of an independent kingdom of Wales, 𝗧𝗹𝗲𝘀𝘀𝘀𝘀, who died in 1093, unsuccessfully opposing the Norman advance. Now that's according to Ancestry.com. In North German and Dutch, the name Rees is a nickname for a very big man, which comes from the Middle to Low German and Middle Dutch R-E-S-E, meaning giant. In Germany, the name takes on the spelling of both R-E-E-S and R-E-E-S-E in areas of Rhineland and Lower Saxony. So in essence, both names appear in this cemetery, and you will find that they are buried side by side in the same section, as they are all of the same family. So all of that is just preamble to the story of one man from the Reese family, which I'm going to feature. His name was Andrew Rees, spelled R-E-E-S. He was born in West Stockbridge, Massachusetts on February 4th, 1790, and at an early age he moved to Broome County, New York. In 1835, he came to Michigan, bringing with him a wife and 9 children, settling on a farm in the area west of the village of Battle Creek, where he lived for 40 years. He was considered by all who knew him to be a farmer of thrift and industry, as well as a patriotic and public-spirited citizen. He possessed strong religious convictions as well, taking his family to worship each Sunday with his team of oxen. In later years, he came into possession of carriages and horses. From a political perspective, he was a Whig of the Whigs and supported the measures of that party with enthusiasm. When the Republican Party was later organized, he had already established his views opposing slavery and had an active sympathy for the rights of man, so became a warm supporter and member of the new party's ranks. In 1875, an extensive article was written by pioneer historian A.D.P. Van Buren on Andrew Rees, which later became part of the Michigan Pioneer Collections. He knew him personally and called him Uncle Rees. Van Buren describes Andrew Rees as, "One thinks of an energetic pioneer in the busy scenes of 1836 in Calhoun County, of an incorrigible old Whig, a staunch Universalist, and a cheery neighbor and townsman, of a snug and thrift farmer who had reared a large family of boys and girls who have done much toward the improvement of the township of Battle Creek." He described his farm as having a neat row of log houses. The land was fenced off into lots to raise wheat. He also says that Andrew Rees had the prettiest fences in the county. describing the rails being long and the corners were true and even. He said settlers going to Battle Creek would often drive out of their way to see Uncle Reese's fine fences. He also planted fruit trees earlier than most of his neighbors and had fruit from them long before anyone in the area. In his reasoning for the following example of an incident concerning Uncle Reese, as he put it as, to give a leaf of the life during the palmy days of the old Whig party. In the spring of 1841, the Whigs of Battle Creek, for the first time, carried the vote in the town, electing Dr. Orlando Moffett as supervisor. This was a great victory for the Whigs over their time-honored old foes, the Democrats, and they celebrated it with all the pomp and circumstance of parade, with a great jubilee at the old American Hotel in the village, which was owned by John Rogers. At the meeting, Andrew Reese was made chairman and presided with the happiest spirits on this glorious occasion. After the opening formalities were over and the speeches were made, refreshments were partaken of. A man introduced as Uncle Stark, whose real name was Leonard Starkweather, stepped forward with a toast exclaiming, "Here are the instruments we beat our enemies with," holding a bottle of champagne in each hand. Uncle Reese responded, "The chair is of the same opinion. 3 cheers for that toast." Many Democrats were present, including Sans McCamley, who was an old Hickory Democrat, and also the local judge and the one who built the mill race, which established the milling industry, and was in part responsible for the original platting of the village of Battle Creek. Andrew Reese called upon Judge McCamley, following Uncle Stark's toast, who in turn responded, "The Whigs and the Democrats, may they prosper in all their laudable undertakings." Quickly, Uncle Reese jumped up, swinging his hat, and cried, "3 cheers for the laudable undertakings of the Democrats!" This was too much for the crowd, and everyone burst into laughter and applause. Dr. Edward Cox, the old town doctor, was the one who later recounted these recollections of the evening. There were many more toasts on the evening and a lot more champagne, but one can get the idea from this memoir of the events that the political climate, although spirited, opposing parties were much more cordial in that time. Uncle Reese used to say of the 8th president of the U.S., Martin Van Buren, who was a Jacksonian Democrat, that his political career was like a squirrel going up a tree. You raised your gun to shoot, but the squirrel dodged around and up the other side of the tree. You went around to the other side, and it did the same thing at every move until it was out of harm's way. So it was with Martin Van Buren. We tried to head him off, but he kept dodging out of the way and up into office until he reached the presidential chair. So it's very interesting that ADP Van Buren included this anecdote in his writings, as he was a cousin of the former president himself. Andrew Reese passed away peacefully in his bed on September 2nd, 1875, following a period of poor health at the age of 83. He was highly regarded by those who knew him as a most respected citizen and venerated in the community. The next grave we're going to visit is that of Matthew and Sarah Alden, which at first, when I began to research this, was quite confusing. The main reason being is that one would assume that the dates on their headstone, when there is only one date each, was the day that they died. However, this is not the case in their situation. The dates on their headstone are their birth dates. It appears that the family never had the stone engraved with the date that they died, perhaps because it was so traumatic, as you will soon hear. Matthew H. Alden and his wife Sarah were longtime residents of the Battle Creek area, and they had several brothers and sisters and children in the area. In 1904, Matthew was 80 years old and Sarah was 62. Matthew had been for many years a Methodist minister, and although retired, was often called upon to help the church in ministerial capacities. He and Sarah were well respected in the community as venerable citizens. At around 1:00 p.m. on October 26, 1904, they were riding in a buggy on their way into the city from their home on Reese Road. They pulled their horse to a halt before a railroad train which was approaching. As the train got closer, the horse got nervous and bolted forward across the tracks, and their buggy was suddenly stalled in front of the train. The conductor, seeing the impending danger, threw on the air brake, but it was too late to avoid the catastrophe. The crash was heard from a great distance from everyone in the area. The buggy and the occupants were hurled and smashed to kindling, and the Aldens and the remains of the carriage were driven through a fence a distance of about 20 feet and impacted with a telegraph pole. The train crew and employees from the Malta Vista plant ran down to the scene and found Mr. and Mrs. Alden lying in a ditch beside the tracks, partially covered in the ruins of the buggy. They were picked up and carried into the office of the food company, and Mrs. Alden expired as soon as she was taken inside. They sent for an ambulance for Mr. Alden to take him to Nichols Hospital, and they placed her body on a train to transport to the train station in town and then to the undertaker parlor. Mr. Alden died soon after arriving at Nichols Hospital. So you're probably wondering what happened to the horse. The buggy, of course, was demolished, but the horse, well, he escaped by some miracle without injury. The next graves we're going to explore is that of Frank and Mildred Duffin. Their headstone caught my attention when I was in search of another one in the area that I was in pursuit of. Written on the marker are their names, birth dates, and the statement, burned to death, next to the date of their death, May 24th, 1941. So I became very curious to find out the story behind this one. Frank Duffin was born in Belleville, Ontario in May of 1904. He lived there until he graduated high school. He was a member of the Musicians Protective Union for 20 years, and for more than 10 years was a drummer in dance orchestras in Paterson, New Jersey. He also later played with an orchestra in Marshall, Michigan. Prior to his death, he played with orchestras in Battle Creek and had worked at various jobs until he was eventually hired by Post Food Products. In addition to working at the factory, he also played with the Postum Band. Mildred Williams was born in May of 1901 in Battle Creek, and she and Frank had been married for 16 years. She worked for several years at the Michigan Bell Telephone Company office in Battle Creek, and for a time at the Battle Creek Motor Sales. In May of 1941, they went to spend the weekend at a cottage of Mr. and Mrs. Marlowe Kimball on Fine Lake. The Kimballs were relatives and had just recently purchased a store with a dwelling on the lake. The Kimballs were sleeping in the back room of the cottage, and the Duffins were sleeping in the front room on a daybed. The fire apparently started near the front of the cottage where the Duffins were sleeping. Mr. Kimball woke up at 4 a.m. and found the room filled with smoke and tried to rouse his wife, who would not come around. He tried to turn on the lights, but the electric power was out, probably from the fire. He carried his wife out the back door to safety and returned to try to re-enter the cottage to get Frank and Mildred, but the flames were engulfing the door he had just exited. He tried to enter another window adjacent to the front bedroom, and it was also engulfed in flames. The fire decimated the buildings within a few minutes, and Frank and Mildred perished in the fire. Their bodies were found side by side on the daybed, and the coroner believed that the Duffins were overcome with the smoke before the fire ever reached them. The Hickory Corners Fire Department had arrived, but the store and cottage were already destroyed. They concentrated their efforts on preventing the spread to other neighboring cottages. A neighbor, Mrs. Howard Strickland, suffered a stroke while watching the blaze and was taken to the hospital. The next story I want to feature was that of Lloyd and Clara Louise Casper, as it offers some interesting insight into the life of Battle Creek during World War I. Lloyd was born in 1896 in Plymouth, Indiana, and was the first child of Charles and Iva Ella Casper. In July of 1917, he was living in Battle Creek when his name was called as eligible in the draft, and he reported to City Hall before the Registrations Board. Battle Creek was assigned a quota to furnish 291 men, but the list of eligible names that was drawn was 582. The list was double what was needed to make allowances for exemptions. In August of 1917, Lloyd Casper was on the list of men who had passed the physical and had not asked for an exemption. He would go on to serve in what was to become known as the Great War and later as World War I, and return home safely. He married Clara Louise Newbaum in April of 1922 in Battle Creek, and together they had 2 sons. Clara was born in Buffalo, New York in 1899 and had moved to Battle Creek at the age of 2 with her parents. In July of 1926, the Caspers would hold a reunion at St. Mary's Lake with the entire family, including those from Indiana. Sadly, the following year, Lloyd passed away after a prolonged illness at the young age of 31. Clara would remain a widow and never remarry. She would go on to work at the Postum cereal factory and then the Bell Telephone Company. She died in 1935 after a 4-year illness at the age of 36. This story seemed very sad, with both of them dying so young. One has to wonder if Lloyd's illness had anything to do with the exposure to chemicals from the war in France, as many troops were exposed to mustard gas when fighting over there, but one can only speculate on this. The next story I'm going to cover is another World War I veteran, Sergeant Rancy Ray Kane. He was born in Cecil, Ohio in February of 1891 and was the son of Mr. and Mrs. John Kane. He moved to Battle Creek at a young age and lived in the city up until 1913 when he moved with his family to Climax, Michigan. He worked for the Sherman Manufacturing Company. He went off to the Great War and served in France with the 126th Infantry in the 32nd Division. On August 1st, 1918, in an attack to clear out machine gun nests and snipers in the woods occupied by the enemy north of 𝗧𝗹𝗲𝘀𝘁, France, seeing no officers present, Sergeant Kane took charge of the platoon. He directed the platoon in such a manner to silence the machine guns and killed 4 of the enemy soldiers. He also silenced another machine gun nest in a nearby tree. For these acts, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. Following the war, he married Blanche Bell, and they had 1 daughter. He passed away in 1933 at his home in Climax at the age of 47, following a 5-day illness with pneumonia. As an interesting note, an article published on October 22, 1934, after his death, stated that he had received the Congressional Medal of Honor. However, I researched this on the Congressional Medal of Honor database, and his name was not listed as a recipient. So I believe that the author of the article made an error and was confusing this with the Distinguished Service Cross, which he did receive. The next story is of Lyle McCleary. Lyle McCleary was born September 22, 1920 in Battle Creek to Leslie and Ira McCleary. He went to high school at Battle Creek Central, and when he graduated was employed in 1938 at the sanitarium where he had started working before he completed school. In September of 1940, he enlisted with the National Guard in Kalamazoo. In October, his regiment went to training in Louisiana. His unit then transferred to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and following that to a port of embarkation at San Francisco. He left the U.S. with the rank of corporal and was promoted to sergeant on the shipboard en route to Australia in 1942 with the 32nd Division. While in Australia, he was selected for Officer Candidate School, which he graduated from and was assigned to the 6th Division. On February 20th, 1944, while in Sador, New Guinea, he was wounded when he was shot with a bullet through his right arm, and he received the Purple Heart. He returned to his unit and went through 2 additional campaigns, and then he was sent to a rest camp. It was during this time at the rest camp on September 24th he received a field commission to the rank of lieutenant, as he had been previously through a number of campaigns with the 126th Infantry 32nd Division and was then transferred to the 20th Infantry. He had begun fighting in the Philippines with Company F 20th Infantry and was wounded again on January 20th, 1945 in Luzon. He was reported to have received shrapnel in his hand and in the small of his back in a newspaper article that ran on February 19th, 1945. A March 12th article in the same paper, it carried the story that he died from his wounds 5 days later on February 24th at sea on a hospital ship 1 day out of Hollandia, New Guinea. He was buried in the American Cemetery No. 1 at Hollandia on February 26th with full military honors. In June of 1945, the local chapter of the Military Order of the Purple Heart in Battle Creek changed their names to the Lieutenant Lyle Clayton McCleary Chapter 110 in honor of the first member to lose his life in the war. Lyle's father, Leslie, would pass away the same year in December and is also buried at Reese Cemetery. In 1949, Lyle McCleary's remains were returned to Battle Creek along with 12 other local war dead from the Pacific and reburied at Reese Cemetery. The next grave we're going to explore is that of George Eckelbecker. He was born in Vicksburg on May 4th, 1921, to William and Elizabeth Eckelbecker and spent most of his life growing up in Battle Creek. He graduated from Battle Creek Central High School in 1941. He married Kathleen Marcotte in June of 1941. He was employed as an aircraft mechanic at Kellogg Airfield, and his wife also worked there. As a civilian, he gave the Army Air Force as his preference on entering service. He was inducted May 12, 1944, when he was living in Homer, Michigan at that time. By that time, George and Kathleen had 2 young children. He received his basic training at Shepherd Field, Texas, and was given the rank of sergeant and was placed on a crew of a B-24 bomber named 𝗧𝗍𝗲𝘀 in the 389th Bomber Group, serving as a nose gunner for Lieutenant Dale Williams' crew. He had arrived in England on February 6, 1945, and per the last letter sent to his wife, dated March 6th, he had already completed 7 missions. On March 7, 1945, Lieutenant Williams' crew was scheduled on a mission to bomb oil and communications facilities, as well as a railway marshalling yards at Soest, Germany. The weather at takeoff was very bad, and clouds and icing conditions prohibited anyone from accurately observing the takeoff. However, witnesses state that they saw the aircraft as it later descended through the clouds. It appeared to level off, a wing separated from the aircraft, and fire broke out. The fuselage impacted the ground near Old 𝗧𝗏𝘀𝑒, England in Norfolk, and exploded. There were no survivors. The 𝗧𝗍𝗲𝘀 crew consisted of 10 men, including George Eckelbecker. In a letter of sympathy sent to his wife from his chaplain, they informed her that a prayer service was conducted before takeoff on what proved to be a fatal mission, and that her husband was buried in a lovely green hillside cemetery overlooking a beautiful and peaceful English valley. In January of 1949, the remains of Staff Sergeant George Eckelbecker was returned to Battle Creek for reburial at Reese Cemetery. Kathleen had since remarried. A burial detail of the National Guard at Kellogg Field took charge of the service, assisted by the chaplain at Percy Jones Hospital. The next story is about 2 boys who came to a similar tragic ending and were buried not far from each other in Reese Cemetery in 1949. In fact, it was a year of drownings in the region, which makes for some chilling history. In March of that year, Clarence E. Buddy Miller, the 18-year-old son of Mrs. Alice Miller, was found face down in about 12 inches of water on the northern end of 𝗧𝗏𝗀𝘀 Lake. According to the coroner, Buddy was subject to epileptic seizures and apparently fell into the water while suffering an attack and was not able to help himself. He had been cutting up a felled tree near the water's edge and disappeared. His grandmother had asked a neighbor to go looking for him, who ultimately found him. Later that same year, on July 4th, a 13-year-old girl named Barbara Jean Horde drowned while swimming at Willard Beach. She was visiting family in the Battle Creek area with her mother from Chicago, and there were some 3,000 people on the beach that day shortly before 7 p.m. when she was last seen. It was around 9 p.m. after her mother had been combing the beach for 2 hours looking for her that she approached the the lifeguards for help. They formed a human chain walking the beach line far out into the water and found nothing. One young volunteer received a laceration on his foot and was taken to the hospital. Barbara Jean was eventually found around 9:30 p.m. by a former lifeguard submerged in 15 feet of water near the diving dock. When her body was recovered from the water, her mother collapsed from shock and was taken to Lila Hospital for treatment. The article stated that this was the first drowning at Willard Beach in 16 years. 2 weeks later, Ronnie Lee Morgan, aged 14, drowned while swimming at the Verona Dam on Saturday, July 19th around 6:00 p.m. Witnesses say he dove off the downstream side of the dam into the maelstrom below and surfaced struggling and then was sucked down again and never resurfaced. Firemen, sheriff's officers, and volunteers launched boats from the Verona Beach launch within minutes of the time his friends reported his tragedy and began dragging the river. A friend named Mike Murphy, who was age 15 at the time, had leaped into the frothing water with Ronnie when he saw him struggling and narrowly escaped himself. The river from the dam to Emmett and downriver were searched into the night looking for the boy. His body was eventually recovered and he was buried on June 23, 1949, not very far from Buddy Miller. On the same day Ronnie drowned, another story ran on the same front page of the newspaper of an 18-year-old boy named Leonard Moon who had drowned in a swimming hole near Charlotte. He apparently jumped into the deep water and did not know how to swim. His body was recovered from 18 feet of water by 5 sheriff's deputies using a grappling hook about 45 minutes after he went under. The final grave I'm going to feature is that of Myrtle Jettner, whose story might remind you of the vintage posters of Rosie the Riveter. Myrtle Jettner was born February 13th, 1918, in Seattle, Washington, to Walter and 𝗧𝗹𝗀𝘀𝘁𝗵𝘄𝗲. She spent her formative years in the logging camps of Meriwether, Michigan, and Orlander, Wisconsin, where her father was a lumberjack. She married William Hackworth in 1934, and together they had 4 children. During World War II, they took their children and joined the family in Seattle, where she became one of the many women who stepped up to serve her country. She became a welder in the shipyards. Being small in stature and unafraid of heights, she became a valued employee. She could get into tight, small areas and weld where many could not. She went on to become an instructor and taught numerous women to also become welders. She received certifications from both the state of Washington and the state of Michigan as a welder. Upon returning to Michigan, she became a welding instructor for Allen Industries. After the war, she stayed at home for many years as a homemaker before eventually returning to the workforce working for the Kellogg Company. She worked in the packing department from 1948 until retirement in 1976. She married a second time in 1951 to Robert Jettner, whom she met when she worked at Kellogg's. Presumably, her first marriage ended in divorce a few years after the war ended. She retired as a member of the Kellogg 25-year club and moved to Seattle on retirement. Robert Jettner passed away in 1995 and had his ashes scattered at sea. Myrtle Jettner passed away in 2005 and is buried at Reese Cemetery. So that's going to conclude today's journey through history at Reese Cemetery. If you liked today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to check out my podcast, Tales of Southwest Michigan's Past. And until next time, thanks for watching.